All right. Well, it's 6:02, so I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. On behalf of the OPC, my name is Sandra Stevenson, and I'm a governor on the OPC board. I'm also head of the program committee and deputy director of photography for the Washington Post. And tonight's chat is co-sponsored with the Asian American Journalists Association, and I want to thank them for partnering with us on this. And just so people know, this is the latest installment of our OPC Book Night series. Our moderator tonight is my esteemed colleague, Tracy Jan, who is Deputy Health and Science Editor at the Post. She joined the Post actually in December of 2016 to launch a beat on the intersection of race and the economy. She is, and I can say with 100% certainty, she is one of the most sensitive, caring editors our newsroom has. And she is also has a 20-year friendship with my former colleague from the New York Times, Ed Wong, who is here with us tonight, who is currently a diplomatic correspondent at NYT. He has reported for 13 years from Iraq and then from China. He is also an OPC scholar. I don't want to give too much away because, I know Tracy will also have some words to say. But I also want to let the audience know, when I first heard the two of them speak here at the Post in conversation about what we're going to talk about Ed's book tonight, um, I knew that this would be something that the OPC community would be interested in hearing, and I'm thrilled that both of them have made time to join us. Um, on that note, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And on that note, I will kick this to you, Tracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us tonight. I am always excited to appear with Ed. Just a little bit about our friendship. We first met over email in 1999 when I was actually living in Taiwan on a Fulbright fellowship, and Ed was traveling through China, the first of many trips that he would make to retrace his father's army travels. I'm very envious of Ed because I've always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. At the time, I was working at an English language newspaper in Taipei. Fast forward to 2017, Ed and I were both living in Washington, D.C. in Adams Morgan, which I did not know, but I happened to run into him at a mutual friend's party of old China hands. And my son happened to recognize his daughter because they went to the same school at the time. And that's how we discovered we were neighbors. Um, Ed and I had talked about his book right before the start of the pandemic when he was about to go on book leave, the worst time to go on book leave because there's no childcare. And so, Ed, I was hoping you could ground the audience in how you were inspired to write your book, and you could kick us off with a slideshow. Thanks, Ed.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Tracy, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm especially delighted to be talking with the OPC because, as Sandra mentioned, I got a scholarship from OPC when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and in some ways it was one of the seeds that was planted for my career later as a foreign correspondent and as a diplomatic correspondent. So I have a lot of affinity for the OPC and for the people associated with it. I've been to its headquarters in New York for various panels and events throughout my career. So thank you very much. And thanks, Tracy, for that introduction. So, when I thought about the end of my time in China for the New York Times, I had been stationed there from around 2008, right before the Olympic Games. The Beijing Olympics came to Beijing, which was sort of the coming out party for China, to the end of 2016, midway through the first term of Xi Jinping, the current leader of China. I thought I wanted to somehow do write a piece of work that would summarize my thoughts on China, on my ideas on where it had come as modern day China, as communist ruled China, and where it might be going. And it would wrap in my reporting from my nearly decade there. And I thought I also wanted to make sure that it had the right contextual history in it, because I think that China is a very difficult place to understand if you don't have at least some of the contemporary history. And in this case, mainly from the Mao era onward. And as we know, Mao took over China in 1949. It is now, I think it's safe to say China is the most successful authoritarian country in the world, in that the same party has ruled China for all these decades, and it has ruled it in a manner which has allowed China to ascend to superpower status. And many of the people who live in China now feel fairly, nationalistic or patriotic about the country. So then I thought, what's a good way of writing a book that captures a lot of this? And I thought, writing a book that would have strong central characters and a very personal angle might be able to pull the average reader, the lay reader, along through a narrative about China and Chinese history. And I thought that my father's story of his time in the People's Liberation Army could be a good way of channeling the history of China during the Mao era and some of these ideas of China as an empire, which I'd formed during my time there. And then at the same time would tell a parallel history of my time in China from 2008 onward. So I set out to write that book starting in 2018 after I moved back to the US. And then it took me 6 years to complete that project. What I'll do now is I'll run through a short slideshow that will help me tell you the story of that Mao era history of China when my father was in the army, and then we can talk more with Tracy and with all of you about some of the other issues and themes in the book. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'll run through this slideshow with you, and then we can talk more afterwards. So, all right. All right. So this is the book that I came out with in June, At the Edge of Empire. The theme of the book, Empire, is right there in the title. And it's also about the conception of frontiers around China and how those define China. They don't just define China in a marginal way, but they're essential to China's conception of itself, at least in the guise of the Communist Party. So this is my family. This is us at Mount Vernon, Alexandria, George Washington's home. It's a very American photo, and this is us growing up, my sister and I growing up in Alexandria. There's my dad and my mom. And during my time growing up, this is how I saw my dad. He would put on this uniform every day to go work in a restaurant in Alexandria, a restaurant called Sampan Cafe, a Chinese restaurant. And he would go there 6 days a week, working very long hours. I barely saw him when he came home late at night. I knew that his job was tough. And I didn't really know much about his background in China until I was in my 20s, when at one point I decided I would sit down in my childhood home with my parents over several nights and interview them about their past in China. And I had gotten interested in China because I'd started studying more about the history, the politics, the society in graduate school at UC Berkeley. And so my dad then placed this photograph in the palm of my hand, and it's a photo of him in a People's Liberation Army uniform taken in 1953 in China. It's one of two surviving photos of him in this army uniform. And so this is the first sense I had of this whole other life that he had led at one point in his early adult years, well before he came to the US, and something that I knew nothing about. And so I began learning more about that as I interviewed him. And then when I came back in 2018 and decided to undertake this book project, I went much deeper into those questions that I had asked him earlier and found out a lot more about his life. And so he was born in the British colony of Hong Kong in 1932, and there he is with his older brother, Sam, 4 years older than him. And they grew up in Hong Kong. They were the children of a merchant family, a Cantonese family from southern China that had moved to Hong Kong. And their father sold herbal medicine, imported herbs from China to the British colonies, sold herbal medicine from a shop in Hong Kong and then to Southeast Asia. So his father was very much a sort of bourgeois capitalist. And he grew up in that family, middle to upper middle class. And then the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong interrupted everything. That took place in 1941, just hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had already set out to wage war on China, and now was trying to take over much of Asia. So it invaded Hong Kong in December 1941. My grandparents then sent my father and his brother Sam and a few other people to their ancestral county, Taishan County, in China to seek shelter there because they thought that they might be safer in the Chinese countryside than in Hong Kong under Japanese occupation. And so they went to Taishan County, did various forms of schooling there, and then went to high school in Guangzhou, the provincial capital of Guangdong province. And that's where my father went to a prestigious boarding school. Here's a photo of him with cousins and schoolmates at a swimming pool in Guangzhou. He often liked to go swimming. And then the Japanese lost the war because of the atomic bombs that America dropped on Japan. But the Chinese Civil War between the communists and the nationalists reignited after the defeat of the Japanese. And then my father heard about the march onward of the communists as they began taking over more and more parts of northern China. And he also began hearing about the communist ideology, how the communists would bring a more equitable society into being in China, how they would get rid of the corruption of the nationalists, how they would stabilize the economy, and how they would industrialize China to put it on par with America and Britain and other world powers. So he started falling under, I think, the spell of the rhetoric of the communists in his late high school years. And then the communists win the Civil War. Mao raises the flag of the People's Republic of China in 1949 in Beijing. My father at that time is here in Guangzhou, graduating from high school in his final year. So in 1950, he is in the first class of graduates from his school and from every other school across China to enter a China ruled by the Communist Party. And at that time, he decides he's going to go to university in Beijing in order to become part of the communist revolution and help the communists realize this vision of China. His brother, Sam, who's 4 years older, decides to take the opposite course. His brother has already graduated from high school, and he decides to accept a scholarship from the US government to come here to America to study engineering. And he takes a ship to San Francisco and then ends up in Washington, D.C., where he studies engineering at George Washington University. But my father instead goes northward to Beijing. And here's a map of China. As you can see down there in the south, you see Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and he goes all the way up to the far north in Beijing by the Great Wall. Just as a side note, this map is made by the same map maker, Jeffrey Ward, who did the maps for the Game of Thrones books that George R. Martin wrote. So it's kind of a cool map. I think it's the first one he's done of China. Anyway, so my father goes up to Beijing for university. On the first anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, he marches in Tiananmen Square with soldiers, students, factory workers, and above them in the stands is Mao, and there are other Chinese leaders up there waving down to them. And then a few weeks later, my father drops out of university to enroll in the military because at this time, the Korean War has been raging for a few months, and Mao has ordered Chinese troops to go into the Korean Peninsula to help the North Koreans fight off the American forces. And my father believes that it's his mission to help defend China and North Korea against the Americans. So he joins the military, gets put in the Air Force. He goes up to Northeast China, and there on the map, you see North Korea up there in the Northeast, and you see the cities of Changchun and Harbin right above North Korea near Russia, and that's where he trained for the Air Force. But then a few weeks into his training in Harbin, in the second Air Force Academy he's placed in, he is told he will not be going to the Korean Peninsula. He'll be put into an army unit instead that goes to the far northwest of China, to a place called Xinjiang. And there on the map, if you go over to the left side of the map, you'll see this area called Xinjiang in the far northwest near Kazakhstan and Russia and Mongolia. And so he gets on board a series of trucks, army trucks, and a train, and they go far out to the west, um, past the western end of the Great Wall and into this vast area of deserts, of mountain valleys, of snow peaks, of forests. And it's essentially Central Asia. And there, he is part of the army, and he takes part in essentially controlling that area, Xinjiang, where many Kazakh Muslims and Uyghur Muslims live. And some of you might know a little bit about the recent history of Xinjiang because the repression of the Uyghurs by the Chinese government has been very much in the headlines in recent years with a system of internment camps, high-tech surveillance, and other measures that the government has imposed on the region. So my father was placed in these different postings in Xinjiang, which is a very remote area. And here you see a photo from a trip that I took to Xinjiang in 2014 when I was trying to trace my father's footsteps and trying to figure out what his army unit had been doing out there. And this is what the area looks like now. It's still an area with, very much an agricultural tradition. This woman here is a Kazakh herder, and there's still many Kazakh herders. They don't live a fully nomadic life like they used to. The party eventually put many of them into these settlements, but in the summer they still herd livestock. And my father engaged in some of that while he was out there in the army. And in my father's final posting, in his 6 years there, he was sent to a place called Wenchuan, the most remote place that he was posted. And this is a photo of Wenchuan in contemporary times. It's an area that's very close to Kazakhstan. And he was put into a military agricultural garrison there that was the first, among the first of many of these garrisons that would later spread across Xinjiang and be very integral to communist control of the region. These were these farming garrisons that were staffed by units that were associated with the army. And so he was there along with Kazakh soldiers herding livestock in that garrison near the Kazakhstan border. And then in 1957, Mao and other leaders asked young people who had cut short their education to take tests to try and re-enter university because he needed more talent to help industrialize China. So my father saw this as a chance for him to get back into interior China. And so he takes an exam, gets into university in Xi'an, which is in the northwest of Beijing, and he studies aeronautics engineering there. And here's him on a break from university in Beijing with a cousin. But then several things happen in the late 1950s that make him decide to leave China. The first is while he was out in Xinjiang, he had won the trust of military officials out there who said they would sponsor him for membership in the Communist Party. And so he was very eager to win membership in the party. But when he was in Xi'an, he was approached by officials who said that they were going, not only would they put on hold his application, but they would have to investigate him and his family because he came from Hong Kong and his brother had gone off to America. And so they needed to investigate his family and himself for potential subversion of China. And so he knew that something was wrong here, that he had put in all those years in the frontier and the party didn't trust him. Around the same time, Mao also started the Great Leap Forward, which was an industrialization plan. And that ended with this, the worst man-made famine in contemporary history, this famine that ended up killing 30 to 40 million Chinese. And my father and his classmates survived that on their campus. But as you can see, my father emerged very emaciated from that. Here is him in around 1961 after the famine. And he fell ill during that famine, could barely get out of bed. And so he saw that where the policies of Mao were leading. And so he decided to make an escape to Hong Kong. And he went back down to southern China, called in favors from family friends. And one of them was a police officer who owed his family a favor. And the police officer got him this document, this travel document that he would use to leave China for the Portuguese colony of Macau, which is right down there in the south near Hong Kong. And so he went to Macau, and then a few months later, he made it out of Macau to Hong Kong, his birthplace. And he never looked back and wondered about that decision to leave. And in 1967, a few years after re-entering Hong Kong, he goes with his grandmother, flies to Washington, D.C., to America to immigrate there and join his brother Sam. And here is the family celebrating the grandmother's 90th birthday at a restaurant, Jade Palace in Chinatown, Washington, which is where I was born a few years after this in 1971, after my father had met my mother. And so they move out to Alexandria, the suburbs, which is where I grew up. That's us in our childhood home where my parents still live. And then my father didn't go back to China until 1999 when he went on a short tour with my mother and my sister while I was in grad school. He had retired from restaurant work by then. And then he returned to China again in 2008, in 2009, actually, when I got married. And at that time, I had been posted to China to work in the Beijing bureau for the New York Times. And then he returned again in 2012 when my daughter was born in China. And so that was his last trip to China to visit me. And then I continued working in China for 4 years beyond that until 2016, when I moved back here to the US and then eventually to Washington. So his story comes full circle when he comes to see me in China, and we make several trips around China in 2012, including to Guangdong province, to visit some of his old haunts and see some of his old high school classmates at the same time that Xi Jinping has just taken power and is making his own tour of Guangdong province to signal the policies that he will implement in China. And we can talk more about that later in this discussion. But that's essentially the story of my father and how, I was essentially became his proxy for his encounter with the People's Republic after he went to exile. And then I went back in a way in his place to continue that engagement with China, but on my own terms. So thanks a lot for listening to me in the slideshow. And then I'll be glad to speak some more, Tracy, and then we can talk more with all of you also.
I love that, Ed. Thank you so much for sharing the slides.
Right.
I want to talk about this scene from your book back in 2014 when you were the Beijing bureau chief for the Times and you were in Xinjiang looking for records about your dad's service in 1952. And I remember you calling your father in suburban Virginia to tell the bureaucrat about the base where he served with Kazakh and Uyghur soldiers. Can you talk a little bit about that and how your dad reacted to you being there?
Yeah. So you'll remember like the first slide that I showed from contemporary Xinjiang with the female herder and the sheep. That was from that trip. I went up. I would often take reporting trips for the New York Times to Xinjiang, and there was one reporting trip that brought me up to the area of Altai, which is on the border with Russia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan, right at the very northern tip of Xinjiang, very remote area. Once heavily under Russian influence. And so I went up there and I went into the town. I wanted to seek out any documentation of my father's army unit. And so I walked into the civil affairs office in the middle of town after having checked into my hotel. I knew at some point the police would start looking for me because Xinjiang is a very sensitive area and border areas in Xinjiang are especially sensitive. And when you check into a hotel, you have to hand them your passport. They make a copy of your visa and fax it over to the police station. So I knew that as soon as the police saw that there was a journalist in town, they would start seeking me out. So I only had, I thought in my head, a few hours to try and find any evidence of what my father and his unit had done there. So I went to the civil affairs unit, met a woman who was very helpful to me because she had once been an Army veteran and now worked with she had once been in the Army, now worked with veterans as a veteran herself. And so she started trying to think of ways she could look up what my father's Army unit had done. But it was always a little bit hazy what unit he was in. So I had to call my father, who was, we were 12 hours ahead in China, and it was morning. I think it was getting to evening in Xinjiang, and it was morning in DC or Virginia. And he answered, and he was completely stunned that I was in this remote place that had taken him weeks to get to in the early 1950s, and that I was calling him from the middle of a government office. And he was puzzled what I was doing there. So that was one of those, like very bizarre moments where I'm standing in a town that my father had been in his very first posting. And then I was able to connect him with someone who had just been in the military decades later, and they were having this conversation about what his unit had done.
Awesome. I see questions starting to flow into the chat. We will have time for questions in a few minutes. Ed, can you tell us about how you got your father to even open up about this time in his life? I mean, we know how chatty Asian dads can be. I have one.
Right. Yeah, and you're saying that sarcastically. So for those of you unaware of it, like Asian dads are usually famously reticent about their personal lives. So I mean, I had started, I think as I said at the opening of this talk, I'd started interviewing my parents in my 20s about their lives. And that was when I first learned my dad had been in the Chinese army. So I think that I did that, in part for a student project when I was in grad school at Berkeley. So I think that had already kind of broken the ice on my dad talking about his past. And I didn't find him very reluctant to talk about it, but I had to take the initiative to pry it out of him. He didn't offer up any of the information when I was young. And then when I came back to the subject in 2018 onward, he was pretty open about it. I think that earlier session with him decades earlier had helped. And I also think that, at this point, he's still alive right now. He's 92. And I started interviewing him in the second phase in his late 80s. I think, there have been many decades since he was in the army and since these kind of traumatic events of his life. So I think he was okay talking about it at that point. I think he realized that there was value in some ways in sharing the history with me and in the fact that I would share it with the outside world, because I think that when a lot of people are that age, they think that the events that they lived through, there is some lessons that can be learned from that, and a sense of the importance of that history that could be lost if it's not documented in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. So had your father read the book? What's his reaction?
Well, he was pretty integral to the writing of the book. So I would interview him, then I would write the chapters. Then, I wrote as I finished each chapter that involved him. Not all the chapters involve him because some of them are about contemporary China and my own time there. But each chapter that involved a narrative about him and his life, I would share with him in draft form, have him read those. He would then fact check the chapters, make sure I gotten the facts accurate, plus that I gotten the right emotional resonance of what he was feeling at those moments. And then I would make fixes to the chapter. So he was very much involved in the process of fact checking and of my revising of the chapters. And then he read a galley copy of the book in the spring once that was ready. And I asked him to make any corrections that needed to be made to that copy.
How does he feel about it? Like,
He's pretty
does he,
proud of it. He was
yeah,
just
good.
asking me, he was just asking me the other day, like on Sunday, I was over at their place for dinner. He was asking me how the book's doing, like whether the reception had gone well for the book. And I told him yes, including the Washington Post, I think, had chosen as one of the top nonfiction books.
Reads.
Yeah, so I was very happy about that. And my parents were happy since the Washington Post is our hometown newspaper, as well as, the host of this chat along with OPC. So anyways, they were very happy about the reception. My dad, I think, is happy that his story seems to resonate with people, and also seems to say something larger about China. And I think he's also happy that younger generations, including many Chinese Americans, are learning about the country and about the history on their mouth through his story.
You and I were discussing in the past, a couple months ago, about this issue of exile and identity. And you mentioned that how, as Chinese Americans, some people feel like we exist partly in exile, balancing our personal desire to maintain a tie to the motherland, even if we weren't born there, and the complexities of navigating the current geopolitics, especially as journalists. Can you elaborate on that and how your father makes what your father makes of the current communist role under Xi?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, China has gone in a much more autocratic and authoritarian direction. I think it was already, I mean, obviously, under the party, it has always been an authoritarian state. So I think at some point in the 80s to 90s, some people, policymakers in Washington, and maybe many Americans thought that, oh, maybe there's a potential for it to politically liberalize as the economy liberalizes. But I think sometime in the 2000, late 2000s to 2010s, people started realizing, oh, the party will not relinquish power to other competing, groups. And so, and under Xi Jinping, I think that that's accelerated that trend. I think my father looks back at that and sees, I think when Xi took power, he wondered whether she might impose greater, reforms on China that would liberalize it in some ways. Perhaps further economic liberalization, maybe something on the margins politically, um, and also reform the party. I think he saw Xi as a potential force for disciplining the party and the corruption that had become endemic in many parts of the party. And then, he, along with the rest of the world, has watched as Xi has become more autocratic over the years, including deciding to stay in power for a third term beyond the norm of 2 terms. And so I think my father's conclusion from that so far is that she is going down the same, blighted path that Mao took, where Mao held on to power, became more and more remote from the people and from the needs of the country, and in fact started exercising power in disastrous ways across the country, culminating in the decade-long cultural revolution, which I think many people have heard about. So my father thinks that she is going down that path, and he thinks that China needs to, if anything, Chinese citizens need to be wary of what could be happening to their country. I think, as Chinese Americans, it's hard watching a country that you might have some affinity for going down this much darker route. And Xi's decisions have increased tensions between China and America, of course, and China and other parts of the world. And so I think that, we try and navigate that space. I still report on I report on U.S.-China relations as a major part of my beat, but I report on it from the perspective of Washington. So a lot of, the way I frame my stories is from the way that different administrations in Washington, both the first Trump administration, the current Biden administration, and the incoming Trump administration interpret China. And so, I think that we're going to see greater tensions in the years ahead. I don't see that ebbing anytime soon.
Yeah, you and I have similar but also very different experiences as Chinese Americans. I grew up on the West Coast in the San Francisco Bay Area. My parents are from Taiwan, but they are very disdainful of the view of Taiwanese independence. And even though they're Taiwanese, they're also very defensive about any criticism of China. Um, I was wondering, one thing I found surprising in your book is the specter of war with Taiwan. Is that real or bluster? If you could talk about it from your perspective of your current beat.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we're destined for the U.S. is destined for war with China over Taiwan, and that China, to me, it's still an open question of what she might decide to do to Taiwan over the next few years. Clearly, the Chinese military has become a lot more aggressive around Taiwan in the last couple of years. There have been a lot more incursions by fighter jets across the invisible median line. There have been a lot more
Data mine alerts every time that happens.
Yeah, I know. I try and turn those alerts off. I think right now there's a Chinese, PLA exercise going on around the island. They've been doing many of these sort of exercises where their naval ships surround the islands, almost sort of like a simulation of a blockade. And so there's been a lot more aggression. There's many cyber attacks daily on Taiwan, as people will tell you, like efforts of cyber espionage and undermining certain electronic systems in Taiwan, as well as sowing disinformation. So I think there's a lot of aggressive moves that he is doing. But in terms of a full-on invasion, I think that's an open question, because I think it's a question of, whether they think that the costs are worth it. It's a question whether they think that's the best way to try and bring Taiwan under communist rule. It might not be the best way. And it's a question of their national power relative to the national power of America and other countries that might be opposed to them, including, for example, Japan, Korea, European allies of the US, all of these countries. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. Here in Washington, some US officials have pointed to the fact that Xi Jinping has told the PLA to be ready to seize Taiwan by 2027. But that doesn't mean that he is telling them we have an invasion plan for Taiwan. We plan to carry it out by 2027. That just, in Communist Party speak, that's a way of galvanizing an agency or part of the government or part of the party to just get themselves in shape and to really mobilize. But whether he carries out some sort of plan is a different question.
Got it. I want to let the audience know to please put your questions in the chat. I have a few more questions for Ed, and then we will get to audience questions momentarily in about 2 minutes. Turning to your career path, Ed, as journalists, we are challengers of the status quo, agitators, if you will. But that's not how a lot of immigrant parents raised us, to work hard, keep your head down. Can you talk a little bit more about your path from the suburbs of Virginia and working at the Potomac Gazette to one of the top papers in the world?
Yeah, I mean, my roots are very much in the DC area, so it's funny. I went to school at UVA and then came back to the DC area to work a series of odd jobs because I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my life after having gotten an English degree at UVA. And after backpacking for a while, like half a year in the Middle East and Mediterranean Europe, I decided I wanted to try and become a foreign correspondent because I wanted to be able to do exactly what I'd done on that trip, which is just talk to lots of people, find out interesting stories, and then later on tell them to the world. So I applied for I saw an ad, I think in the classified somewhere back when there were still classified ads, for those of us who remember that. And it was an ad for this job at the Potomac Gazette, and I applied for it and got it. And so it was this weekly newspaper where I was reporting, that was owned by the Washington Post company, actually. And I reported on community news in Potomac, Maryland. Then later I studied Chinese, went to China to study Chinese in Beijing, went to graduate school at Berkeley, and then did several internships while I was at grad school, including at the AP in San Francisco and then the New York Times. Interestingly enough, I had gotten those internships. One of the ways I got into the New York Times internship, I learned later, was because I'd written these long stories from Hong Kong during the 1997 handover summer. Like I'd gone there in June with a few other Berkeley students to try and do freelance reporting on the run up to the handover. And so I got some stories published in the LA Times and in some other places. And then I submitted those clips to the New York Times later for an internship. And the interim coordinator at the time said that those clips stood out. So I think that, if you're set on being a foreign correspondent or reporting international news, it's good to just seize whatever opportunities come your way to actually do that and to get published and to get clips if possible. And then later on, I think that will open more doors for you. So I did this internship at the New York Times. They asked me to come back after graduate school, which I did. And then I worked on several desks at the New York Times as a junior reporter, Metro, sports, business. And then 9/11 happened. And I think that was the big break, which it was for many young reporters at the time. And in a way, like the post 9/11 world is the one that's defined my adult life. So I went off to Iraq soon after that war started. I volunteered to go report on Iraq and stayed there for 3.5 years for the international desk, and then went to spend a year in Taiwan after that, and then from there onward to the People's Republic of China for nearly 9 years. So I think that, the other thing that I've learned from my years as a reporter is that when events happen, when news happens, then you want to jump on it. Like you want to have this instinct of wanting to be in the middle of it, in my opinion. Like there are some reporters who don't feel the need for that and their beats don't really call for that. But I think if you're reporting as a foreign correspondent or on international news, you need to have this hunger to be in the middle of events, even very traumatic events. And so when both 9/11 happened, and the wars afterwards happened, I wanted to be reporting on those. And I was kind of disappointed when, as a young reporter, they didn't ask me to go to Afghanistan when that invasion happened. But I was very young, very junior. But then with Iraq, they needed more people, so they sent me there. And I was pretty excited at the time to be going there to report on Iraq.
Thanks, Ed. I want to open up to audience questions. Does the moderator from OPC want to read them off?
Sure. We have one first question here from Bill Holstein. Ed, how did the West simply not understand who Xi Jinping was and what he believed in ideologically? I've heard it described as one of the worst foreign policy mistakes of the century.
I would say that, yeah, I mean, the type of leader that Xi Jinping turned out to be blindsided many people. I don't think that people had illusions about someone coming to power and like doing full on overhaul of the party. I don't think anyone expected that. No one expected a leader to come and try and democratize China, for example, or even nudge the party in that direction. But people largely thought that she would be a colorless bureaucrat who would be part of this rule by consensus that the party has established after the Mao era. And Hu Jintao, his predecessor, was very much in that vein. And during his rise, through the ranks of the party, she never exhibited any particularly colorful instincts. He never showed any inclination for consolidating power in the way that Mao had consolidated power. So people, I think, didn't really have a sense of what he would do once he attained the top position. I think the elders who put him in that top position party didn't realize that either. I think they wanted someone who would be there to discipline the party and steer the party back in some ways to some of its original roots as a Leninist organization that was tightly controlled by the center, because it had become a much looser organization in the decades before that. But I also don't think that they thought that she would go after potential rivals and enemies at the top tiers of the party in the way he did. And so he moved very quickly, consolidated power, and then that allowed him to rule China with a much greater authoritarian hand. But because of the way that he rose through the ranks, keeping fairly quiet, just carrying out policies that weren't particularly adventurous and not challenging people for power in an overt manner, people didn't see the type of leader that he would become later.
Okay.
Is there another question? Yeah.
Yes, we have one other question at the moment. Patricia Kranz asked, did you speak Mandarin or Cantonese at home with your parents? Did language ability help you cover China?
I think language ability is very valuable for covering China. I know some very good reporters who have gone to China with very little Chinese, but I think that in general, on balance, knowing Mandarin is very helpful. Mandarin is by far more helpful than Cantonese. I grew up speaking Cantonese in my household with my family. We spoke both English and Cantonese, and I was much more fluent in Cantonese, before I started studying Mandarin as a young adult. And so I started studying Mandarin in my 20s after graduating from college and then going to Beijing after that newspaper job at the Potomac Gazette to start studying Mandarin. And that was obviously helpful and kept up those studies in graduate school, and then later on did more studies in between Iraq and China. But I think having Mandarin is very helpful. Cantonese works very well in the south of China, in Guangdong province and in Hong Kong, but it doesn't really help you in other parts of China because the languages are very different. I would also say that on balance, like being of like Asian descent helped me in China because I could go around to different places, very remote places like Altai, which we talked about, sensitive places, Xinjiang, Tibetan areas, towns where protests were happening, and people wouldn't really look at me twice. The police who would be on the streets, the average citizens, they wouldn't really look at me and think, oh, there's some a weird presence in the town or someone from an outsiders in the town. Even if I spoke to people and they heard my accent, I usually speak with a Cantonese accent. People say I sound like I'm from southern China. They'll just assume I'm someone whose ancestry was in the South, or I was visiting as a tourist in some areas from, say, Guangdong, and I would sort of just say I'm Cantonese. I would tell them straight up I'm Cantonese, which I am, and they would just accept that I was like, there from Guangdong province or something like that. So I think that helps, like looking Asian and then being able to speak Mandarin.
Even speaking Mandarin, for me, it's hard to understand accents in different parts of China. Even understanding the Beijing accent,
Yeah.
I have the Taiwanese accent. When I was in Taiwan, like I could speak Mandarin, I can't read it, and I was trying to interview officials over the phone in Mandarin to cover the 1999 earthquake, and I remember them saying, wow, your Chinese is so good, when they found out I was an ABC, American born Chinese, but I didn't have the right vocabulary to interview officials, like the official language that you
Right.
hear on the news. I have a
Yeah.
conversational Mandarin, so it's still very difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult. And I think the accents or the different dialects makes it like doubly difficult, of course. And so sometimes I would travel to different parts of China with a Chinese reporter from our bureau. And, especially if they were from that region, then they could understand the regional dialect or the regional language. So Sichuan is a good example. And I encountered that pretty early on when I was there covering the 2008 earthquake in Sichuan. And it was very up there in the villages, in the mountains, like it's very difficult understanding people when you're just speaking standard Mandarin. And you need to have beside you someone who can, understand some of the local language or the way they speak, I think.
We
There's
do
another
have,
question from William. Go ahead.
yes, you see it. Yes, yes. So the question is, how has Xi's more aggressive use of cyber espionage and penetration of American institutions impacted the Chinese American community? Are they worried about getting caught in the middle?
I would say, I think that's a good question. I would say that it's some Chinese Americans are worried. They're worried about the general geopolitical tensions that have arisen. They don't want to be put under unfair scrutiny. I think that's probably more true of recent immigrants from China, less true of ones who've been here for multiple generations. Recent immigrants or people here on various forms of visas, I think, feel under greater scrutiny these days. And that started, I think, in the Trump era also. So it's not just like she's more aggressive policies obviously provoke a reaction from the US government. But, in the Trump era, there were also very aggressive initiatives that resulted in overreach in some areas. So one good example is the China initiative that the Justice Department undertook, where they were aggressively investigating scientists who had come from China. And so in some of these circumstances, the cases didn't really hold up. The Justice Department had to dismiss the charges or never brought charges. And then in several places, the judges in the courts dismissed the cases. But for many of the Chinese visa holders or Chinese immigrants who were the scientists in those cases, then they had their research and their lives turned upside down by these investigations. And so that's an example of them being caught in the middle and feeling a lot of pressure. And that's, I think, in some ways, Bill, that's what you're talking about in terms of China increasing its espionage and the spillover effects that has on the American government, but it's also an example of overreach on the part of some American agencies as they try and grapple with this growing question of espionage by the Chinese government.
Those are good questions. We have about 8 minutes left, and I just want to make sure we answer everyone's questions. So please type away. Or Sandra, Patricia, any other questions from you? No, I'm going to keep talking to Ed because one of the things we didn't get to earlier was about writing. Since this is about your book, I want to encourage folks to get a copy. Where and when do you write the best when you were working on your book?
I mean, my writing process was kind of a mess because I started it in 2018, right when I was starting this beat covering diplomacy and foreign policy for the New York Times. And so when you're on my beat, it's a heavy travel beat. Like I'm often flying overseas, either with the Secretary of State or to report on events overseas, like when Trump met with Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, for example. That was in 2019, or sometimes doing enterprise stories or investigative stories and then going to country to report on it. And so when I'm traveling, I find it impossible to write. Like I tried writing on airplanes, I tried writing in hotels, but it's just impossible to get into the mindset and to have the right energy and the right vibe to write on the book. So I would often, in those early years, wake up early in the morning and try and write while I was in DC, in those times I was in DC, write on weekends. And then at some point in the early part of the pandemic, I got a book leave because I think it was transitioning from Trump to Biden. And so that's often a natural time for some reporters to step back and work on a book or other project because you have a new administration coming in. So I took a book leave, was off for some months, and did a big chunk of the writing then for the first draft, enough to maintain momentum on the book and to feel like that I would end up finishing the book. I think for many book writers, that's the point that you want to reach, is you want to reach a point where you know for 100% that you're going to finish this book, that you're not going to abandon it as a project. Once you're at that point, then I think you're basically in the home stretch, even if you have, say, a third of the book or a quarter of the book to finish. Because, just like running a marathon, a lot of writing a book is psychological. We all have the tools to do it, like you and I, Tracy, like we write for a living. We all know how to put together sentences, and our writing is cleaner and sharper than the writing of the average person. So I would say that because we've been doing it for decades, and we know how to do research, get facts. The question is like whether you can complete that marathon, I think.
I really admire discipline for sure. We do have a few questions that came in through the chat, so if you want to kick it off.
Sure. Yeah. The first question from Erwin is, what about China's pressure on Chinese immigrants?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk these days in Washington of what's called transnational repression, which is in some ways how China reaches across borders to put pressure, oftentimes to put pressure on people with ties to China in order to try and keep them silent, to keep them from talking about things that are happening in China. And I've done stories on some of these people who are here in Washington who are feeling the long reach of the party. Oftentimes they are, for example, people like Uyghur Americans who are here trying to talk about those internment camps that were set up in Xinjiang some years ago. And they've had family members that disappeared that are in the camps or in the prison system in Xinjiang, and they want to speak out about it. And China says, well, threatens them by having police, for example, in Xinjiang contact other family members of theirs and saying, well, if your relative in the US keeps talking about this issue, then one of you might go to prison also, or we'll keep your family member who's already in prison or in a camp there longer. And so there definitely is this effect. I think it's not that widespread. I think it's very targeted. I think that they're reaching out to very specific individuals. And I know Chinese who often, speak out about some of the issues in China, but they have no contact with officials in China or with officers from security agencies. So it's not, I don't think it's a widespread phenomenon, but I think it does happen with certain people who are speaking out in a very political manner about what's going on in China.
Hey, we have a question from Sandra. How are you feeling about US-China relations as the second Trump administration takes hold? And do you think it will be difficult for journalists to cover?
That's a good question. The difficulty of covering it I covered both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, and they're very different. The first Trump administration, they're not as disciplined, about their messaging. In some ways, my colleagues and I would hear more differing voices on the inside about the debates that were going on. And you might hear about them from the administration, you might hear about them from the Hill, from Congress. But I felt like in some ways you could get more of a window into the internal debates that were happening. It wasn't it's funny because people talk about the potential for fascism, for authoritarianism. Obviously, Trump has shown some of those tendencies in his public remarks. But in terms of discipline, the first Trump administration is very much not, for example, a Leninist style organization. There were many loose parts of it, and you could make contact with them and learn about some of the things that were happening internally. I think the Biden administration, is more disciplined in terms of its messages and hides the internal debates going on better from public view in many ways. I think many White House reporters and others would agree with me on that. But Trump covering foreign policy and Trump was much more unpredictable because it wasn't done through an interagency process most of the time, where there would be these discussions, and then there would be a lot of meetings, and then there would be a decision that would be made. Instead, oftentimes Trump would send out a tweet late at night that would have some proclamation involving policy, and then you would have to try and figure out, is he serious about what he's saying? Do other people in the administration agree with him? Will they carry it out, or will they push back against it? And so it was very chaotic in that sense, and that made it harder. In that sense, it was more difficult to cover. I think that obviously U.S.-China tensions were very high under the first Trump administration. They've also been very high at many moments in the Biden administration. For instance, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, or when the Pentagon discovered the spy balloon over the U.S. So I don't think that tensions were that much lower in the current era. And I expect tensions to remain high in the second Trump administration. I think there is a huge element of unpredictability in how business leaders who are close to Trump, people like Elon Musk, who do a lot of business with China, will, how their suggestions might conflict with those of more hawkish national security advisors, people like Marco Rubio, the incoming Secretary of State, if he's confirmed, or Michael Waltz, the incoming national security advisor, who are more of in some ways, focused on the national security aspects of the competition and not as interested in commercial dealings with China, which Musk or others around Trump might be interested in. That dynamic played out a lot in the first Trump administration as well.
We have a question from Liz. What do you personally feel about being on WeChat and TikTok?
I'm pretty cautious when I use WeChat. I learned that, in my time in China, because we know for a fact that Chinese security agencies, the police, can monitor WeChat. So I'm very cautious when I use it to contact people I know in China. I use it mainly just to, check up on how people are doing, or to, if I'm in China, it's just to say, oh, let's meet up and have a meal. I rarely use it here in the US. I just don't feel that comfortable using it because I'm a very public figure who has written a lot on China and who's on the radar of the Chinese government. The TikTok I don't use. I don't. I know friends of mine use it, but no one in my household has TikTok or uses it. I think that the discussion of whether it's a national security risk is theoretical. Any of these tools can be weaponized by a government like that in China in a moment of crisis. I think the potential is always there. They haven't, from what my conversations with U.S. officials who monitor it, they have not weaponized it yet in any concrete or substantial manner. And I think the question that is more relevant to me as a parent is like whether letting your kid use TikTok contributes to their, personal and mental growth or whether it inhibits it. That's the more salient question in my mind.
I love that your daughter is not yet using TikTok. I also don't have my son using TikTok, although my parents do communicate with me on WeChat. So I will try to get them off the platform to like Signal or something.
Yeah, it's better for them to use another platform to communicate with you, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate all the audience questions. That is all the time that we have today. We are past 7. So thank you everyone for joining. And thank you especially, Ed, for gracing us with your presence and the story of your father and your book.
And
Thanks.
thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Tracy. Thank you, Tracy
Yeah.
and Ed. It was really great. I really appreciate your time. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks. And have a great holiday season to everyone.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.